Dear students, welcome to a chess class on the King's Gambit opening. Today I will show you how to handle this sharp and aggressive opening from Black's point of view. I will share my own repertoire, my own moves that I use to neutralize it and get very decent positions with the Black pieces. If you're a beginner chess player, I will do the explanation of the very first moves as well, so that you could follow this video more easily. However, if you're an experienced player, I hope to share quite a few new ideas with you as well. If you're ready, let's begin the class. Imagine that our opponent plays the move e4, we go e5, and they surprise us with the King's Gambit. The move that we're going to be playing here is d5. Most popular response by white against this will be pawn takes d5. However, it's very important to look at least one or maybe even two alternative moves for white. First of all, white could go very wrong with taking the pawn on e5. If you're new to the game, you can try pausing the video and finding a very good move for the black pieces. Here Black has the move queen h4. It's not only a check, but we're also attacking the pawn on e4. So after they block it, we could finish the game with queen e4 and white's rook is lost in the corner. Even if they didn't block the check, for example, the only alternative here is to move the king forward onto e2 square. It's terrible. We can take on e2, follow this up with bishop c5, and white will soon have to give up pieces and maybe even the queen in order not to get checkmated in this game. So it's very important to remember this trick, as this queen h4 is always in the air in our opening for the black pieces. One of the moves which is less popular at the higher levels is knight to f3. Now this move is not that bad, but we will equalize very quickly with black as well. Here we're gonna play the move pawn takes e4, after which they will go knight takes e5, and since white's knight is very active on e5, it makes sense to start exchanging it. After normal development by white, for example, knight to c3, we could just simply take, and they take. And now we can highlight white's problem of pushing the f4 pawn so early by playing queen to d4. Can anyone tell me how white is intending to castle in this game, for example? So it turns out that the only way for white to continue the game in a normal fashion is to play queen e2, apply the pressure on e4, after which we can simply take on e5 and have no problems in this position. Black has no weaknesses. We're going to develop the pieces to absolute best squares in the center. We will be able to castle, and I think that the position will play itself, or at least you're in good hands in order to start the middle game very soon. Now let's go back to the position where we looked at knight to f3, which is okay move for white but doesn't promise an advantage. We looked at the terrible move pawn takes e5, and now it's time for us to look at the main move of white, pawn takes d5, after which we're gonna play the move pawn takes f4. It's imperative to remember that once again we're threatening the deadly check on h4. This time it's not gonna win us the game perhaps, but it's gonna give us very big advantage. So for example, if opponent plays d4, knight c3, b3, a3, against any of those moves we're gonna be playing queen h4. And at the very least, white is losing the right to castle, which is already a significant advantage. If they do the terrible mistake and block the check with the pawn, well, then they're likely gonna end up losing the bishop or losing the rook, which all gives black a winning advantage. So just remember that in this position, this queen h4 is always in there for black, and now we can also understand why white's main move is knight to f3. This move is simply intending to stop black from getting this check on h4. Over here, black has a choice, and the move that we're going to be playing is knight to f6. Here is the explanation of why I don't want to recommend taking the pawn on d5 right away. For example, if we take over here, and white plays the move knight to c3, normally in this position, we would like to retreat the queen to f5 square, if possible, if it was a safe square in the long term. Queen is very active here, and she babysits the pawn on f4. Remember that we're pawn up after all in this position. However, the problem here is that once they play d4, the bishop will come to d3 and kick us away. So if they didn't have this bishop, this would be excellent for black. For this reason, we're gonna first play the move knight to f6 and apply pressure with the knight on this pawn on d5. Over here, white has three main moves. Maybe there are more, but in today's video I'll cover the three that I think are the most popular. It's bishop b5 check, bishop to c4, and defending this pawn on d5 with the pawn to c4. Now let us take a look at bishop to c4. We're simply gonna take here on d5 and imagine that they take and we take, and we're getting to very similar position. Remember what we had a moment ago? Exactly this position, but here we don't have the white's light square bishop. And this makes the queen on f5 actually super safe. We're guarding the pawn. She's also annoying to our opponent's pieces because she's very, very mobile and active from here. And in this position, they could go very, very wrong if, for example, they castle. Even grandmasters have played this move. Black has a very simple plan of developing the queen side with bishop to e6, then long castle, and huge, ferocious pawn storm on the king side. So objectively even, black is actually having a winning position here. For example, let's say they play a natural move pawn to d4, and we actually can play the move bishop to e6, because if they play d5, which seems to be like a tactic, we could long castle with pinning the pawn, and after this move black can play bishop takes d5 and enjoy the 2 pawns advantage plus significant development and still the attack on the king side. Even if they didn't push and didn't blunder the second pawn, black's game is very easy. Castles, then develop the bishop and attack the white's king. I think the position once again should be playing itself if you have good general understanding of the middle game. So if grandmasters play the move bishop to c4 here, after knight takes d5, they usually not exchange on d5. They most likely are going to castle, after which we can develop the pieces to natural squares, for example, bishop e6 and bishop to e7, and the knight goes to c6. These are not the only squares, by the way, it's possible to develop them slightly bit differently as well, and castles. Black has very good development, active pieces, no weaknesses, and a safe king. Everything that we want out of the opening. Who could have told that this was a king's gambit? We have very solid position. Now let's go back to the moment where we had a few branches. We now took a look at the move bishop to c4. Let us take a look at another ambitious move, which usually players with the black pieces here are afraid of seeing. What if they defend this pawn with a pawn? Well, we're gonna start developing the initiative and bombarding, undermining their center with the pawn move to c6. What's the idea? Well, the idea is that if they do take, we will have now significant lead in development. And after, for example, a move like d4, we could follow this up with a check on b4, castles, then the rook comes to e8, the bishop comes to g4. The problem is that not only black has initiative, and we're going to be applying a lot of pressure on their central pawns, but also they're a bit late to castling. Rook e8 is going to come with a check, and black has very, very good game, both practically and objectively over here. So when we're offering this pawn on c6, it's really very dangerous for white to accept it. Usually people just play d4, after which we can play bishop b4 check, say knight to c3, and win the pawn on d5. White could win their pawn back on f4, and after castling, black has solid position. Material is equal, we can play knight to c6, then bishop e6 or f5 or g4, depending on what opponent chooses, rook to e8, and you have arrived at a good middle game. I think you should be happy with the outcome out of the opening with the black pieces. One more move that we're going to be looking at today, which is very important because it's the most popular choice of whites, is bishop to b5. Well, what's the idea behind it? The idea is that this pawn on d5 is always vulnerable, and so they're looking for ways to get rid of it or exchange it very quickly. So it's possible for black to play moves like bishop d7 and knight d7 here, but the move that I am recommending is c6. continuing with the same style of initiative, because it's actually a risk-free here for black. They must probably take on c6. Then we take back with the knight. It's also possible to take with the pawn, but I rather have solid pawn structure. White can get some extra central control with pawn to d4. Black can continue developing with bishop d6. And for example, if they play d5, this would be a terrible tactical error for white. If you're new to chess, I recommend pausing the video and finding a tactic here for the black pieces. We can take this pawn for free, because if they take our knight, we have a classical discovered attack to win the white's queen. The queen is under attack, and at the same time, it's a check. So white is more likely to castle. Black can continue with castling as well. And I want to say welcome to the middle game. Black has comfortable development, which may differ depending on white's setup. They could try playing ambitiously on the king side with the moves like g5, or rely on more solid approach, not to take the risks of overextending on the king side. For example, white could play the move c4, black could play bishop g4, knight to c3, and rook to c8. Here we have a very decent middle game with all sort of threats. For example, if white is not careful here and plays the move like rook to e1, we could simply take on d4, and once they take back, there is bishop to c5, which wins the queen by pinning it to the king. That's another way to highlight the problem with playing the King's Gambit and moving the f pawn prematurely. If you enjoyed the class, consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. My contacts are on the right side of the screen. I'll be waiting for your emails. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next class.